What's happening, guys? Welcome to another video. My name is Milmast, and in today's video, we're going to be working on my Civic a little bit more. So we are almost now full bolt-on with this car. We have a full catback exhaust system, we have a tune, we have a cold air intake, but we have a little bit more on the intake side that we can upgrade so that we can get more power while staying naturally aspirated. So we aren't going to be touching the internals of this engine whatsoever. So we're going to be keeping that reliability up there, but we're going to be upgrading one of the parts on this car, the main part, the intake manifold. We're going to be replacing it with another version of a Honda intake manifold. Now, by swapping the manifold that's on the car, we're going to lose a little bit of low-end torque, but we're going to gain that back in the top end with peak horsepower. I'm super pumped. Let me show you the parts that we have today in this video, and let's get started. So this here is a PRL intake manifold adapter kit. Now, if you want to install this RBC manifold in the easiest way, you would use this kit. However, the problem with it is that it will heat soak much more than the route that I'll be going. So this manifold comes off of the earlier version 8th-Gen Civic SIs that come with the K20 engines. I've performed a bit of work to this manifold to get it to this point. However, just note that if you use a PRL kit, you will need a stock untouched manifold. Now, I'll get into that in a little bit. I have a K20 thermal gasket that will prevent the transfer of heat between the engine and the manifold. I have a K-tuned water bypass kit along with some Honda Bond. Now, this adapter will allow me to run the coolant that's passing through the OEM manifold around it instead of through it, which will drastically help with reducing intake air temps. I have this injector kit from P2R that will allow me to run the factory injectors in the RBC. I have this throttle body adapter kit that will allow me to run a different throttle body than the smaller one that comes on the K20 engines. Now, I'm going to be using a much larger J37 throttle body from an Acura ZDX, and that will allow the RBC to get more air from the cold air intake. I also have this little wiring harness that will be used for the throttle body. And lastly, a different intake coupler from Acuity, since the throttle body will be positioned in a different location. The outlet of the coupler is also larger, since the throttle body is larger in diameter. So after going through all these parts, we can begin with removing the stock parts that are all found in the engine bay. Begin by removing the clamps that secure the silicone intake coupler up to the throttle body, along with the PVC tube coming off the valve cover. Simply wiggle them off and set the intake parts aside. Moving closer to the engine, remove the main 6-wire connector that is clipped into the factory throttle body. Using a flathead screwdriver might help with taking it off. Since I disconnected the two coolant lines going to the throttle body in my previous video when I installed the Acuity cold air intake kit, there's nothing else to disconnect. However, now would be the time to do so if you do have your throttle body coolant fed. Then, using a 12mm socket, crack loose all 4 of the bolts that are securing the throttle body up to the intake manifold, and then remove them. With them out, you can set the entire throttle body assembly aside. Then, using a 10mm socket, remove the 2 bolts that are holding down the front portion of the intake manifold cover, and then grabbing the middle rear of the cover, pull upwards to slide the rubber grommet off the stud. That will expose the fuel rail, fuel injectors, the wiring harness, a bunch of vacuum lines, and all of the mounting bolts. To get started with taking these out, the wiring harness has to come out first. Begin by removing the 2 10mm bolts that secure the fuel rail grounds onto the intake runners. Now, they'll be found on both sides of the valve cover stud. Using an extension and socket, take them both out. Then, on top of each of the injectors, push down on the little tab securing each of the connectors and pull up on the harness. Repeat the same thing until they're all disconnected. Then, to remove the harness once everything has been disconnected, pull out on both the small plastic tabs and slide the bulk upwards off of the fuel rail. Then on the intake manifold, we'll find the map sensor and the harness leading to it. Using a pick or flathead, lift up on the tab and remove the connector from the sensor. Follow the harness down the manifold and disconnect the 2 opaque zip tie clips. There will be one more large connector at the end of the harness. With it disconnected, you can slide the wiring harness out from in front of the intake manifold and flip it towards the driver's side to give you less clutter around the manifold and fuel system. Next up comes removing the vacuum lines leading to the intake manifold. Now let's begin with the larger of the 2. Using some needle nose pliers, slide the spring clamp off the end of the line and then twist the line back and forth until you can slide it off the nipple on the manifold. The other vacuum line can be removed from the manifold if you push a pick through the eyelets. Now, you can leave the other end of the hose attached for now. Looking at the bottom of the intake manifold, you'll find the manifold support bracket. Now, it supports most of the weight from the intake system. Remove the 2 nuts using a 12mm socket and ratchet. There's an additional 12mm bolt that secures the bottom side of it onto the engine block. Once you remove it, you can take the support bracket and bolt out in one shot. This is what the setup looks like. Then, from the top of the manifold, remove the 12mm hardware securing the plastic portion of the intake to the aluminum runners. Take these 3 out on the left, 2 more up on top, and then the other one is going to be found tucked behind the throttle body flange. After you take out that last bolt, you should be able to slide the plastic manifold off of the studs of the aluminum runners. You can't remove the manifold just yet, as there is an additional vacuum line coming from the PCV valve. With some needle nose pliers, slide it off the hose, and then pull the hose off the manifold. The hose secures on the manifold right here, and here's just a couple more angles of it so that you guys have a better idea as to what this looks like when you guys are doing this process. Now, before we can unbolt the aluminum runners, we need to disconnect the fuel components. Place a rag underneath the transition from the soft line to the hard line for the fuel rail, as a bit of gas might leak out when we disconnect it. Push upwards on the tan plastic fuel connector holder towards the metal fuel rail. You can then slide it off the line. Then, if you have some silicone lube, spray it on the fitting and jiggle it to help encourage the spread of the silicone. Then, pinch the plastic teal tabs inwards so you can slide the flexible fuel feed line off of the rail. You should notice some fuel leaking as soon as you disconnect it. You can then crack these 12mm nuts free and remove them. They're securing the fuel rail up to the aluminum intake runners. Following that, using a flathead screwdriver or pick, remove all 4 injector clips securing the injectors onto the rail. Now you will spill more fuel at this point. Since the rail is obviously filled with fuel, as soon as an injector comes loose, the fuel will follow suit. Since the injector clips are now removed, they can either come out with the rail or get stuck in the runners. Now, if any do remain in the runners, you can wiggle them out given that there isn't dirt that is surrounding the seal. Because if you do take it out with dirt in there, the dirt will fall into the port, which isn't good. With all the injectors and the rail out, it should look like this. Now, underneath the aluminum runners, we'll find this coolant hose and clamp that are both attached to the runner. Using some needle nose pliers, slide the clamp down the hose, but don't remove the hose from the runners for now. The next step is going to be remove the runners. Now there's 5 bolts and 3 nuts with studs securing it up to the cylinder head. Once you take them out and pull it from its gasket on the head, you'll see a little bit of coolant spill from the right side of the cylinder head. Now should you want to avoid this entirely, you can drain some of the coolant from the radiator. Now I demonstrated how to do this in my last video. If you'd like to see how I did that, you guys can click the link on the top right corner. After you slide the runners off of its mounting studs, you can twist off the rubber hose from the underside of it. This here is where the coolant will have poured out when you remove the runners from the head. Now it will make a mess unless you drain the coolant beforehand. The last part of the intake system to remove is the factory intake manifold gasket. Now be careful when removing it because this thin multi-layer steel gasket can cut you rather easily. Don't ask me how I know how. Now before we can just go ahead and start slapping on all these new parts on the car, we need to transfer a couple pieces from the OEM parts onto the new parts. Let me show you which ones we got to take off. So in the factory manifold, we have an OEM map sensor, and it needs to be transferred to the RBC manifold. You can find it after the throttle body, and the port on the RBC is also post-throttle body. Using an 8mm wrench, remove the bolt securing the sensor into the manifold, and then transfer it into its new port. If you want to ensure that the rubber seals from any sensor fully seat and don't pinch themselves while you're installing them, you can apply a little bit of silicone lubricant to the O-ring. This product here is a little bit thicker than your typical fluid that comes out of an aerosol can, which means it will give the O-ring a little bit more protection. Just apply a dab of it on the O-ring and then wiggle the sensor into place. Align it so that you can feed the factory bolt into the manifold and then secure that as well. Now short from that, that's all that we really need to transfer over from the old parts. We'll need to install the factory fuel rail and injectors, however we already took those off and we don't need to install them. Now you of course can upgrade them, but it isn't necessary. To commence the assembly process, grab the thermal gasket and slide it over top of the mounting studs. You can see it only goes on one way, which makes the install stupid-proof. So, with it on the studs, we can then follow it up with the modified RBC manifold. Now to get this manifold ready for this swap, we need to cut it and then port it. So this is kind of how the manifold started off. Now I purchased a used one to save me a couple bucks, and it was poorly painted black, and if you guys know me, I wanted to clean it up and make it look great prior to installing it. So I used a die grinder and started to remove some of the casting marks from the manifold. If you look closely, you'll be able to find a bunch. In addition to that, some of the threaded studs will not be needed, along with the coolant port on the right side of it. Now, because I won't be running any kind of manifold cover, and I don't want to heat soak this aluminum manifold, they're all going to be going. For the stubs, I used an angle grinder to chop off the bulk of it, and then I followed it up with my smaller die grinder to make it look seamless. You can see roughly what it will look like. As for the coolant port, it's a bit more of a process to get it chopped without making it look so obvious. Now we're going to need the thermal gasket to get that done. Using some hardware to secure the gasket up to the manifold, grab a Sharpie and trace where the gasket ends. This will tell us where we need to cut off any excess material. Then, using an angle grinder, hacksaw, or whatever way you'd like, start by cutting the aluminum back until we're left with the contour that we have traced. This process shouldn't take too long, maybe a couple minutes, but after you have it done, it's just a matter of cleaning up the lines and making the manifold look like the coolant port was never there. The same thing goes for the stubs on the manifold. As for the manifold inlet, the RBC bolt pattern is different from the stock throttle body, and also that of the ZDX, so we're going to use an adapter. And with that being said, the RBC inlet is 6mm smaller than the outlet of the adapter, which means that if we want to get more airflow to the engine, we can shave off 3mm from the entire perimeter to increase the airflow to the manifold. Now, doing this step isn't mandatory, but using some carbide milling bits to jump up from a 64mm inlet to a 70mm really helps with allowing more air to get into the engine. 19.6% more to be exact. The nice thing too is that you can also remove the internal casting lines, which will also help with airflow. The less that the air has to travel around something, creating turbulence, the higher the CFM. Now, this milling bit and die grinder combo do such a good job at cutting back the aluminum into small pieces, which means the grinder doesn't create any airborne aluminum dust. Now, I highly recommend this bit if you guys are looking into doing this kind of work. Now, the aluminum little chunks will go pretty much everywhere, considering the grinder is cutting and flinging it all over the place. If you don't make a mess with it, I'll be surprised. With the inlet ported to 70 mils and with the adapter mounted, you can see that we have a nice transition between the two pieces, meaning there won't be any disruption of airflow between them. You can choose to paint the entire manifold if you would like, or leave it as is, but because my manifold was poorly painted black and was chipping, I decided to sandblast the entire thing and paint it once more. What's a couple more hours tacked onto this install? Now that you're up to speed with what needs to be done to the manifold, slide it over top of the studs of the head and start tightening them to spec. As always, the torque specs for everything will be in the description box. Next up is going to be installing the water bypass. So we don't want the intake manifold to have the hot coolant running through it, as it will raise the intake temps, hence why we cut off the coolant ports on the manifold. Now, this water bypass will allow the coolant to be routed in the same orientation as stock, however it isn't attached to the manifold. It's the only difference. To install it, you have to remove one upper bolt on the RBC that we just installed, then slide the water bypass over top of the factory stud on the bottom right, followed by reinstalling the upper bolt through the bypass and the manifold. It should look like this. Now take it out. Now that was only a test fit to ensure that we trimmed the right amount of material from the RBC manifold. To properly install it, we need to apply a good amount of Honda Bond onto the backside of the adapter, even though it has an O-ring. Spread it around and then we can install it. I also have the torque specs for the adapter in the description. You can then slide the OEM coolant hose under the manifold and onto the bottom of the bypass, along with a factory clamp that secures it. Now, we aren't quite done yet with the bypass. You'll notice that there's an opening on the front of it, which allows you to run an auxiliary coolant temp sensor. Now, I don't plan on installing one for this engine, so you can install the MPT plug that comes with the bypass. To ensure that you have a leak-free connection, apply some Permatex thread sealant and then fasten it in place. The kit also comes with extra hardware should you want to tap the head so that you can run this extra bolt, and that will allow you to not have to run any kind of Honda Bond for this mounting. Now, I didn't want any aluminum filings going anywhere in the engine bay, so I didn't opt for that route. Anyways, the intake should look like this as of now. The next step is going to be installing the fuel injector adapters. So this kit from P2R comes with the factory O-rings that you will need to install on the adapters. Using some gel-like lubricant like Super Lube, roll the O-ring over top of the adapter until it sets into place. Be careful when doing this because the aluminum has some rather sharp edges. Just note that I'm using these P2R injector adapters as a cheaper route to running Acura RDX injectors or Injector Dynamics injectors. Those pieces are going to set you back a couple $100, however they are necessary if you plan on running something like E85. Now, I'll be maxing out the stock 310cc injectors going full bolt-on, so keep that in mind. With all four adapters ready to go, we can install the factory 9th-gen injectors into them. To seat each one into place, I'm using some liquid silicone lubricant as it will spread around the seal when you rock it back and forth. You want to fully seat the injector into the adapter so you don't see any silver from the injector, just like I have right here. And then repeat the same process for every injector until they're all installed. Now, I also bought replacement seals to replace the ones on the injectors. However, they weren't that bad, so I didn't bother replacing them. However, if yours are cracked or damaged, I would. Because the rail is going to be sitting a little bit higher due to the added height of the adapters, they'll need some different hardware to secure the rail up to the manifold. Remove the factory rail spacer and 12mm nut from both ends. Then thread one of the nuts upside down, followed by the other 12mm nut threaded right side up, so that you have the two flanges facing each other. You want to tighten the nuts together on the stud rather tight. Now, when you use a wrench to rotate the lower nut counterclockwise, it will allow you to extract the stud from the manifold. Repeat the same process for the other stud. You can then grab the left two injectors and place them in their corresponding holes in the manifold. Now I'll place them back in the same port that they were prior so that there's no chance of messing anything up. Grab the other two and then do the same thing. Next up, apply a bit more lube to the upper injector seals and then secure the fuel rail over top of the injectors. Reuse the old injector clips that secure the injectors onto the rail and ensure that they're secured in place. Now, I ran into a bit of trouble trying to use the P2R hardware to secure the rail in place since the injectors and adapters weren't completely seated. To be honest, it's a bit tricky to do by hand, so I grabbed two slightly longer bolts so that they would reach the threads. Once you tighten it down, you can see that the rail and injectors will settle themselves into place. I then swapped the longer bolts for the stainless ones that come with the P2R kit, and then they could reach the threads for the RBC manifold. You can then grab the factory fuel rail feed line and slide it onto the end of the fuel rail until you hear the plastic connector make a click noise. Don't forget to attach the plastic fuel connector holder. Now we need to hook up the wiring for the fuel injectors. Route the wiring harness in the same way as it was before. Connect all four of the connectors onto the injectors. Then we need to find a new place to connect the grounds since the RBC doesn't have the same threaded holes on it. Remove the center 10mm nut on the valve cover along with the left one, as the ground cables will be now secured to those locations. If you're running any kind of different manifold and you're not using this adapter piece, the fuel rail won't be pushed out as far and the rail tabs for the harness won't need to be pushed back like they do for me. If you would like to as well, you can extend the wires and tuck them all underneath the manifold for a much cleaner look. But once you have them on, simply tighten each nut and torque them back to spec. As for the wiring going to the map sensor and the connector under the manifold, there are a couple zip tie clips that can be removed since they won't be used with the RBC. You can also remove the plastic assembly surrounding the upper portion of the wiring harness as we can make it look a lot cleaner. Using a pick tool, push in each of the tabs clamping it into place, and that will expose all the wiring. When I installed the Acuity cold air intake, I had to relocate this wire and I wrapped it in a protective sheath and I think it looks pretty nice. We're going to replicate the same thing. Now, all of this is optional. However, if you want to make your engine bay and manifold swap look clean and tidy, this is what I would do. Pull back any existing sheathing or electrical tape on the existing wire and then wipe them down with a rag with some sort of alcohol-based cleaning solution. Then, slide some split sleeving over top of the wire and work your way down it until the wires are encapsulated in the wrap. Trim it accordingly, and then for each end of the wrap, wrap them in some electrical tape to secure it. You can then run the wires on the right side of the manifold and clip the connectors together. With the wiring now taken care of, we now have to sort out the vacuum line situation. So there are two routes that you can go for this. You can choose to use the OEM hose and cut it, but if you would like to keep it for later, you can take it off and then replace it with an oil-resistant hose. Now I bought some 3/8" ID fuel hose, and then I just need to swap the clamps over from the stock hose to this new one, and it will work. The nice thing about this is that should I ever need to swap back to stock, or maybe I'll use that hose for something else, I have it. Buying this little amount of fuel hose only costs a couple bucks because we only need a couple inches of it. It should look something like this when it's done. Now on the other side of the manifold, there's another vacuum port that needs to be connected. The hose that was removed from the bottom side of the stock manifold is what we're going to be replacing here. Now just like before, you can cut it up to make it work, but again, I'm replacing it. Now you'll need a small section of fuel line just like this, attach it on the PCV valve, and then the port on the manifold. Don't forget to attach the OEM hose clamps on top of them. There are a total of 3 vacuum ports on the RBC manifold, however we'll only be using 2. So the third one that's found by the fuel injectors needs to be plugged. Now, I couldn't find anything locally other than a door stopper with a rubber cover, but I later replaced it with some proper plugs that I found online. I'll link those in the description. Now that there will complete all the work leading up to the manifold inlet. However, most throttle bodies won't bolt right up, which is why we'll need to run the adapter. Now, the kit that I originally linked you guys and was telling you about was this kit here from K-Tuned. Now, this kit is not only discontinued, but it turns out it doesn't actually work properly with a 9th-Gen Civic. It might work with a different car, however, it doesn't work with ours. It's too bad because this is a very nice kit where it has an inside sleeve that you can remove so that you can run a stock unported RBC with the sleeve or an unported one without it. And there is no provision for an idle control valve that we will need for the 9th gen. So if you were to try and run this setup, you will need to buy another barb and a hose to get it to work. Now, that leads me to this product here from PRL. Now, this adapter is very similar in the fact that this bolts up in between the throttle body and the intake manifold. However, this kit comes with everything you need. So it comes with a 90-degree barbed fitting, it comes with the hardware to mount the adapter up to the manifold, and then the hardware to mount the throttle body up to the adapter. It also comes with the hose that we're going to need so that we can get the idle air control valve to work properly, and it also comes with a factory gasket for the throttle body. So let's get started with installing this kit. So before we mount the adapter plate to the manifold, we need to install the 90-degree fitting for the idle air control valve. You can use tape or a liquid PTFE sealant to get this done. Apply a bit of it around the perimeter of the fitting and then tighten the fitting into the adapter by hand until it's snug. The fitting should be facing upwards towards the logo. Then grab the adapter plate and position it so that the PRL logo is facing upwards with the text facing away from the manifold. You won't need to run any kind of gasket on the mating surface as it has an O-ring and it will compress once we torque it down. Use the included stainless fasteners to secure the adapter up to the manifold flange. Don't forget to tighten each one of these bolts to spec. The smaller OEM vacuum line on the car can be removed and then replaced with this hose that comes included with the PRL kit. The new hose will need to be trimmed if you want it to be routed in a similar way to the hose to the left of it. Moving on to the J37 throttle body, if you buy a new one like I did, it will come with another map sensor, which won't be used since we have the installed one on the manifold. So you can leave it as is, or buy one of these inexpensive billet aluminum plugs from K-Tuned and replace the sensor altogether. With it installed, we can grab the new gasket, throttle body, and new bolts. Ensure that you have the gasket positioned in the correct way, with the brown side facing the manifold. Then feed one of the bolts through it and thread it into place. Repeat the same thing for the 3 bolts and then follow it up with a proper torque wrench and tighten each one of these bolts to 16 foot-pounds in an X pattern. Now the throttle body will be physically mounted in a different spot, and you may notice that the connector won't reach the actual throttle body. So again, you have 2 options. So option 1 is going to be cutting the factory wiring harness and extending the wires, which will work, however there's no going back. Option 2 is running this plug-and-play 6-inch extension harness that allows you to connect the 2 ends together. It uses OEM connectors so you don't have to cut, splice, or modify your existing harness in any way. Moving on to the last part of the manifold swap, we have this revised throttle body coupler to secure. Even though the inlet of the cold air intake is untouched, the outlet by the throttle body has been relocated, meaning we need a different coupler altogether. Begin by loosening both bolts securing the carbon fiber intake tube by the driver's side frame rail. Then slide the throttle body end in place, followed by the intake tube end. Lastly, transfer over the PCV hose from the old coupler to the valve cover, and then to the new coupler. With everything all said and done, the engine bay should look like this. The new throttle body, adapter plate, and vacuum hoses routed like so. The wiring harness grounds, fuel injectors, and fuel rail installed as you see here, and all 3 manifold ports connected, and plugged as outlined in this video. Now, your budget is going to be the biggest determining factor for which parts you're eventually going to buy if you guys want to replicate this. You can save a little bit more money by reusing the factory throttle body, however, you won't be making as much power. If you want to spend a little bit more, you can upgrade by getting better fuel injectors, you can replace the stock fuel rail with an upgraded one, you can purchase a CNC ported and cut RBC manifold, you have a bunch of other options, however, it all comes down to your wallet. So guys, now that you guys have the entire RBC setup installed, there's just a couple things you guys need to know before you guys actually go and drive the car. So, number 1, because we took the intake runner out of the car and we removed and basically changed how the coolant is going to route from inside the intake manifold runner to now around it, you have to make sure that you top up the cooling system because we lost coolant during this procedure. In addition to that, because we now have a different throttle body on the car, if you do need to perform a throttle body relearn procedure, you'll have to disconnect both terminals for the battery. You're going to have to make sure that they obviously don't touch the posts, but connect both wires together, and that will ground out the system. Leave it like that for 10-15 minutes. Then once you put it back together, the car will start to do its relearn procedure. The idle might fluctuate a little bit, but that's how you would get that done. There's also an option to do that if you have an advanced scanner. When you go in the car and plug it into your OBD2, you'll be able to perform a throttle body relearn procedure. So, 2 ways of doing it. Also, because now we have a different size intake manifold and a different size throttle body, you will have to get a tune. There's no way around it. Now, the tune that I have on the car is a tune that comes included with your Honda Flash Pro. I won't be able to run that tune on this car because it's not optimized for all of the parts that I have and my specific vehicle. So even if you guys find a Honda Flash Pro tune that is close to what you need, okay, that might get you by for a week or two, maybe until you can get a Pro tune, but 100%, take the time, take the money, do a little bit of research, and find someone that can properly tune your car. In the next video, I'm going to be tuning my car with Tuning by Nick. We're going to be going over the entire process of how we're going to get this thing up and running so that I can bring it to him, and then we're going to strap it on his dyno. Hopefully it'll make a little bit more power. Now with this intake manifold, the manifold has a different volume and it has different length runners. This is going to change how the power band behaves. So it's going to shift it a little bit higher into the higher RPMs so that I actually may lose a little bit of power down low, but once you rev it out, you're gonna get a bunch more gain. So we're gonna be able to see that peak horsepower and peak torque, all of that jump. So I'm really hoping you guys are excited for this. I know I really am. If you guys have any questions regarding the video, comment section's down there. You guys know what to do. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.